Udlakut. Udlukut. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Madeline Redfern, and I'm from Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut, and I'm on the board of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and I will be your MC for this luncheon plenary session. So just for fun, because I know you've had a pretty intense and heavy morning, and I'd like to acknowledge and thank everyone who is here because it shows that you are committed and working hard to address the issue of the housing shortage and the homelessness that our people in our communities from coast to coast to coast are struggling with. So I really want to thank you for all the good work that you do. But I also just wanted to give you a little, something to take away, something from my home region. So I left Iqaluit, which was then Frobisher Bay, as a little girl many, many years ago. And not surprisingly, because I lived from Yellowknife to Saskatoon to Vancouver to Ottawa and many other places that unfortunately I did lose my mother tongue, my language. And as an adult, I began to work to regain some of my language. And so I'm going to teach you a little couple phrases in Inuktitut, very, very basic. So in Inuktitut, we say Khanwitbi. Khanwitbi. So everyone, Khanwitbi. That means, how are you? Because that's important when in the work that you do. It's almost probably the first question that you ask your clients, your colleagues, your stakeholders, your partners, community members, family. Khanwitbi. Again, Khanwitbi. Perfect. And then in Inuktitut, we say Khanwini tunga. So same at the beginning, Khanwini tunga. That means I'm fine. Except when I was learning Inuktitut as an adult, you kind of break words down. Thank you. Break. On cue. So, ka means how, same word, for how are you, Khanwitbi, Khanwinitunga. But ni is negative, it means not. And I was like, I was saying to my Inuktitut teacher, who was Irish, trying to teach me about 27 different Inuit dialects, which drove me crazy. I'm like, just teach me one. But nonetheless, Khanwinitunga means, as I said, in sort of Kw'alaams language, I'm fine, but it actually means how, not I. And I was like, what the hell? How does that mean I'm fine? And my Irish Inuktitut teacher said, well, when the first Europeans came to our part of the world, our part of the region, and they would say, how are you? And the Inuit or the Inuk in front of them literally would say, if you flip the words, I'm not how. Process that. I'm not how. So it's really important when you're meeting people, not, because we tend to do it in a sort of off-the-cuff way, right? How are you? I'm fine. But really, sometimes I'm not how. So that's just Khanwitbi. And you say Khanwinitunga, so I'm fine. Khanwitbi. Khanwinitunga, I'm fine. So that's just a little lighthearted, Inuktitut lesson. I hope that you're enjoying your lunch. I have an exciting session planned this afternoon with you. We'll be hearing from Minister of Housing, their Honourable Fraser, and Margaret Pfoh, with the CEO of the Aboriginal Housing Management Association. I'd like to welcome Doug Powson. He's also a CAEH, Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness board member and Executive Director of End Homelessness in St. John's, to welcome Minister Fraser. So if you don't mind coming up. Oh, there you are. The surprise. Kanuti.
Thank you.
Say, Kanuituna. I'm glad you're doing your best.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here with everybody. It's so good to see so many familiar friends and colleagues. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, our first keynote speaker for the afternoon, I just wanted to say thank you to Tim and the CAEH team for getting us started in the right way today. It's wonderful to bring so many people here, so thank you for making this a possibility. I want to also reiterate my thanks to Pam and the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center for hosting such a wonderful meal last night for us, and for getting us, for hosting all of us here on their territory and in their community. So thank you again for that. So I'm excited to introduce our first keynote speaker for the afternoon. The Honourable Fraser was first elected as Member of Parliament for Central Nova in 2015. He has previously served as Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, as Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance and to the Minister of Middle Class Prosperity and Associate Minister of Finance, and as Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. In 2021, he also served concurrently as Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister. Before entering politics, Minister Fraser had a successful legal career with one of Canada's top-ranked law firms, where he practiced commercial litigation and international dispute resolution. He's a longtime volunteer, having served as the Vice President of a local branch of the United Nations Association in Canada, acted as a research fellow at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, and provided pro bono legal services to the local BGC club, as well as vulnerable community members. Minister Fraser holds a law degree from Dalhousie University, a master's degree in public international law from Leiden University in the Netherlands, and a Bachelor of Science from St. Francis Xavier University. Minister Fraser grew up not too far from here in Pictou County and has family throughout the town and county of Antigonish. He enjoys spending time in Central Nova with his wife Sarah and their children Molly and Jack. Please join me in welcoming Minister Fraser.
Hello and welcome everyone. Bonjour, bienvenue, Jalasi, Gui, Nindawisi Sean Fraser, Wadosi Giskuk Basin de Guyanok. It is wonderful to see so many people here and to welcome you to my home province of Nova Scotia, which of course finds itself within the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. It's extraordinary to be able to welcome you all to my home province. This is a place I love, and hopefully by the time that you leave here, this will be a place that you love as well. Before I get into the substance of my remarks, if I could leave you with only two messages today, they would be messages of gratitude and of optimism. Gratitude, because when I look across the room and see what I understand now is 1,700 people who are working in a united fashion to end homelessness, I know that we are going to continue to be blessed with the efforts of people in every corner of this country. And I want to leave you with a message of optimism because given the fact that so many people are pulling in the same direction, I know that we are collectively going to succeed. You know, in ordinary circumstances, the work that you all do every day is extraordinarily rewarding, but also extraordinarily challenging. When I talk to people who work in the sector, trying to find homes for those who do not have one, I find that I'm dealing with people who are committed to a cause, but every day come home exhausted after dealing with an extraordinarily challenging landscape, too often being met with others who have the ability to help but choose not to, too often being met with challenges such as a lack of financial resources or at times a lack of political will by governments who want to assist or choose not to assist. Despite the ordinary challenges that come with working in housing, these past 2 years have contributed extraordinary challenges to the cause. I look at the unique circumstances surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, and I see that a difficult job was made more difficult. When I talk to those who run shelters across Canada, they explain to me just how enormously challenging it was to deal with a set of scenarios where they had to reduce their capacity to protect the public health, keeping people 6 feet apart. I talked to people who said although there was different kinds of support that may or may not have flowed through different organizations, When you're dealing with governments who were focused singularly on defeating a public health threat, sometimes that came at a cost of focusing on other underlying challenges that we lived with before COVID-19 was part of our vocabulary. On the heels of the pandemic, and now that society has reopened to a significant degree, we're dealing with scenarios where organizations tell me it is hard to hold on to good people. There are too many people who knew what they were doing who've left the sector. There are too many organizations who find them short-staffed, but nevertheless persist. We're also dealing with a housing landscape that's only become more and more challenging. Despite the challenges that existed a few years ago, they've been made worse because so many of the homes that were available within the market at an affordable price have been snapped up and improved and re-offered at prices that the people that we all want to serve cannot possibly afford. One of the things that causes me great consternation is the fact that not all of us are impacted equally by housing challenges. And too often, there are people who do not look like me who disproportionately suffer from the consequences of a lack of investment in housing. I look at the challenges across this country when it comes to Indigenous peoples' housing needs. And it doesn't seem fair to me in a country as wealthy as Canada that such an important and significant portion of the population goes without having their needs met. I look at the impact of housing challenges on Black Canadians. In my own province here in Nova Scotia, we're dealing with circumstances where the African Nova Scotian community, despite having been here for more than 400 years, is dealing with a legacy of having their communities razed in some instances, is continuing to live with the consequences of not being able to secure title to individual pieces of land, despite the fact that their families have lived in the same home for generations. There is systemic discrimination at play against marginalized populations. And I look at certain other groups of people who have served this country. I think of veterans in particular, who have served this country, who have literally worn their flag on the shoulder, who come home without the services that they need to be well. My own view is that if we can afford to send our citizens to war, we can afford to take care of them when they come home, including the cost of putting a roof over their head. I think sometimes we have the bad habit of making big problems seem complicated. The reality is, homelessness is not a challenge associated with one's ancestry. It's not purely a result of someone's mental health challenges or mental illnesses. The reason that we have too much homelessness is because there are not enough homes available for people, particularly not enough homes available at prices that they can actually afford. There's a number of things that we need to do if we're actually going to end homelessness in this country, and I do not think that that is too aspirational a goal. As a result of the changing economy over the past couple of years, building homes at a volume that's actually going to help create the supply that we need has become more challenging. The price of land has increased, the cost of materials and supplies has gone up, the cost of labor has gone up, and we're dealing with an interest rate environment that makes it very difficult for so many of the nonprofit housing providers in particular to actually justify going ahead with the cost of a new project. There are hundreds of thousands of homes that have already been approved for construction in this country that are sitting on a shelf when shovels should be in the ground. Now we are starting to take steps to address some of these challenges. You'll all have seen, of course, recent GST measures to reduce the cost of building. There are low-cost financing options that we can deal with. But this is not just about market solutions. There are other challenges that we need to overcome as well. I look, for example, at the need to work with cities directly to change the way that homes are built in communities across this country. Our work with Halifax provides an excellent example of what we can do when we work together with municipal leaders across this country to change the zoning practices, to allow for affordable housing to be built more quickly, to allow for permits to be issued more quickly. By creating federal incentives, by putting money on the table and inviting cities to demonstrate their ambition, we can incentivize change at a pace even a few months ago that I did not think was possible. What excites me more than some of the changes that are being made to zoning and permitting processes is the fact that cities are becoming inspired, one after another, to actually create dedicated teams within their staff that focus exclusively on affordable and supportive housing. When we actually create this culture within municipal governments by partnering with them, we can achieve meaningful progress over time. One of the things that grates on me when it comes to our housing challenges, perhaps more than any other, is the lack of non-market housing in this country. We're dealing with a housing landscape where less than 4% of the homes in Canada are being offered outside of the market. This is less than half the OECD average. What I find most concerning is that this is a direct and predictable consequence of policy decisions that were taken when I was a young kid. The reality is successive governments, and I should say there is blame to share amongst different political parties, both Liberal and Conservative governments, for 30 years decided that investing in affordable housing was simply not the responsibility of the federal government. What we've seen as a result of that lack of investment over decades was a lack of affordable housing. Now we've stepped back into this space with the introduction of the National Housing Strategy, and it's making a difference, but we know that there is more we need to do. We need to continue to commit for the long term to have predictable funding that's going to allow us to build homes outside of the market. Certainly in Canada, it's not too much to ask if you have a job, you can afford a place to live, but nor is it too much to ask that if you cannot afford a place to live, one should be provided to you anyway. The cost of dealing with a shortage of housing. The cost of dealing with a shortage of housing is too great to ignore. People who do not have their needs met run into entirely avoidable circumstances that we all pay for, by the way. We pay for it when people run into challenges with the health system. We pay for it when people run into challenges with the justice system. We pay for it when a person's housing needs are not met and they are not able to fully participate in their community and reach their full potential. But even if we have a policy framework that is perfect, if there is such a thing, we don't actually have the capacity to build the homes that we need in this country. You know, it's been put to me this way before that in almost no sector do we build things the same way we did 100 years ago. We don't build cars the way we did 100 years ago. We don't build anything the way we did 100 years ago, except housing. If we actually invest in the skills necessary to build a workforce that can increase the output of the housing sector, we can make a meaningful dent in the problem that we're facing. But we also need to invest in innovation by creating a clear pathway to demonstrate that there is a market to build at a much greater volume. We need to be investing in innovation that will allow us to build in factories, more mass timber, more modular housing, more panelization, embrace technologies like 3D printing that will actually give us the boost that we need to meet our housing goals when we solve the other policy challenges that I've identified. But one of the things that I find difficult to accept is if we build all of the homes that are necessary, I still will not feel as though we can claim success when our communities are still dealing with encampments. The reality is there are too many people who are living without a place to call home at all in a country as wealthy as Canada. We need to insist that people who live in our communities do better because people who are living in encampments are not a political problem to solve. They're human beings who deserve to be respected and to live with dignity. We are facing unique pressures. We are seeing people from around the world who view Canada as a beacon of hope, that seek asylum, who flee violence, war, and persecution, who do not have a place to live, and too often find themselves looking for space and a shelter when they arrive. Increasingly, and we know this perhaps in Nova Scotia as well as any part of the country, there are people who are literally being displaced as a result of severe weather events driven by a changing climate. My own community has suffered the devastating impacts of Hurricane Fiona. Since then, our province has seen wildfires at a scale we have never seen. Since then, we have seen floods that have taken the lives of innocent people in this province. I was recently in Kelowna for a housing announcement, but I bumped into one of my old friends and colleagues, a former member of Parliament who was my seatmate when I was a new MP. Very recently, his home was burned to the ground as a result of the wildfires that impacted that city. This is part of the new reality that we need to deal with, and we need to continue to embrace ideas that will help overcome some of the challenges that perhaps are new to us but are entirely predictable. And I would be remiss if I didn't address the challenges that young people in this country are facing. It is heartbreaking to me when a young person who is starting their career, making a decision to delay starting a family because they cannot afford to, largely driven by the inability of themselves or their families to find housing that they can afford. And they are not asking for too much. They are telling me that all they want in life is to find a place that they can afford, find a job that they can go to, find groceries that they can pay for, and maybe, just maybe, a couple of times a month, go out for a bite to eat with a friend. That is not too great an ambition for us to offer to a generation of people who feel left out of the housing market. And we can work together to identify these solutions. Now, despite the enormity of the challenge before us, I am filled with a sense of hope and optimism. The reality is I see the solutions. every day to the housing crisis. They're coming from the people in this room. They're coming from the people who are working in their communities and sharing their success stories with Canada. The reality is when we fund new initiatives, it's never the number of dollars that gets me excited. It's the identification of new solutions that's actually going to allow us to solve our housing challenges once and for all, to end homelessness in Canada, to actually bring to an end the housing crisis that our communities are facing. I should draw particular attention to the Action Research to End Chronic Homelessness in Canada. There's a series of different projects, most recently in Medicine Hat, Whitehorse, and London, Ontario. There's other projects in Fredericton, Edmonton, that are recently been funded as well. And what excites me most about the research that's going on, not just in a lab, but in an applied way, is they're identifying solutions on the ground that we can repeat in other parts of the country. I want to make sure that everyone in this room is aware that we've recently opened the next round of the supply challenge, backed by $65 million. But again, it's not the amount of money that gives me hope. It's the fact that we have seen solutions that are scalable and repeatable come out of previous rounds. The work that you are doing to identify solutions on the ground are going to allow us to repeat those solutions in every corner of this country. Now, before I conclude, I just want to say that I've been tasked with a big job that I take very seriously. The Prime Minister of Canada has asked me to put Canada on a track that will actually allow us to see an end to the national housing crisis. I'm not going to feel as I succeeded when my neighbors still live in encampments. I'm not going to feel as though I've succeeded if we lack a supply in the ecosystem to house our country's most vulnerable. And I will not feel as I've succeeded if options do not exist for people to live in their community at a price that I can afford, that they can afford. The task at hand is enormous. The path before us is long. But I believe, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that if we walk that path together, we can bring an end to the national housing crisis impacting our communities. I want to say thank you. This is a remarkable room of people, and together we can make a meaningful difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Kanwipi. How are you? I'm fine. You're doing good. Ayungi. Ayungi is a Nuktitut word that means thank you and celebration and good work and you're clever, and everyone in this room, the work that you're doing is worth acknowledging, including the minister and the governments at all levels, our organizations. Ayungi, thank you. Ayungi, that's what you are. You're doing good work. I want to invite Jasmine Ariolo to introduce the lunch keynote speaker, Margaret Pfoh. But I want to take the time to introduce Jasmine to you. Jasmine is a fellow Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness board member and a human resources professional with over 17 years of working for both the federal and provincial governments, as well as the private and not-for-profit sector. Jasmine is Cree and a member of the Caucus First Nation in Saskatchewan. She holds a master's degree in human resources management and is a strong proponent of lifelong learning, and continues to grow her knowledge and skills. Outside of her professional career, she volunteers with organizations to support healthy communities and is committed to engaging pathways within the community and workplace that support individual well-being. Jasmine, you are the definition of Ayungi. So I welcome you to come up and introduce our lunch keynote speaker.
Wow, there's a lot of us here. Very happy and privileged to be here and feel very privileged to introduce you to Margaret Pfoh. Margaret is Tsimshian and a member of the Lax Kw'alaams Band and a descendant from the Eagle Clan. She joined the nonprofit housing sector more than 27 years ago and is the CEO of the Aboriginal Housing Management Association. Margaret's career has been built on her dedication to serve and support Indigenous peoples, and she currently serves on both the CHRA's Indigenous Housing Advisory Caucus and the CHRA's Board of Directors as president. Her devotion to the Indigenous communities expands far beyond the provincial housing sector. Margaret actively represents the urban Indigenous voice at both national and international levels. By addressing and advancing housing rights for Indigenous peoples, Margaret's dedication to AHMA has propelled her into a variety of influential roles, and she now welcomes over 6 years as CEO. AHMA is the first Indigenous housing authority of its kind in Canada and only second in the world. In 2019, Margaret led AHMA to partner with the Government of British Columbia to create the historic Building BC Indigenous Housing Fund, IHF. This monumental initiative made BC the first province in Canada to offer provincial funding to all Indigenous peoples living both on reserve and in urban, rural, and northern regions. Following the launch of AMA's Urban, Rural, and Northern Indigenous Housing Strategy in early 2022, Margaret became a co-founder of National Indigenous Collaborative Housing, Inc., which is a for Indigenous by Indigenous coalition formed in late 2022. Her leadership at AHMA has also led to multiple inputs for the Federal Housing Advocates' work with the Canadian Human Rights Commission. I'm so happy to introduce you.
Toyak Sitnin, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And Toyak Sim, thank you all for being here today. I'm not sure if I'm going to need these or not. I'm in that in-between time, or maybe I'll call it my denial time of whether or not I actually need to wear glasses to read my notes. But Toyak Sim, thank you all for being here with us today. Before I get into my actual presentation, we have a video here that I'd like to share with you that perhaps says more than anybody could ever convey through a simple presentation. This video is the outcome after a year-long province-wide tour amongst our communities, which included consultation with First Nations, Métis, MLAs, MPs, mayors, and all of our not-for-profits across the province of British Columbia on just how valuable urban Indigenous-led housing solutions could impact their communities. So please bear with me as we put on a 3-minute clip.
When I was looking for housing here, became homeless here in 2015, I could not find a place. You couldn't tell who I am by my voice, but see my face. And there the door gets slammed in my face. The impact of being homeless was just so mentally draining, so devastating. It was raw.
I live in a garage. It's what I can afford.
My sister's living here on the streets of Prince George.
They're living with damp houses, so mold and stuff starts to grow.
Right now in Cranbrook, we have a homeless situation. 43% of those housing people were Indigenous.
It's intergenerational homelessness that's happening.
I support Indigenous housing because
housing is a human right.
And I support empowering Indigenous communities to design and build and create their own housing.
Indigenous housing providers were created because nobody would rent to them. So when we look at Indigenous housing and Indigenous service providers, they're created to offer those services to Indigenous people who were denied them.
The work that organizations like AHMA is so important for our people.
It's absolutely vital that everybody in British Columbia recognises and understands that they have a duty and a responsibility to be considering their own role and contribution in decolonisation.
We have a legacy of dispossession across this country for all Indigenous peoples.
Everybody should care because that could be your child, your brother, your sister, your mother, your father that could be homeless. Everybody should go out and endorse that strategy, show the government that we mean business,
Our home is where we learn who we are.
Let's get this bill. See how many we can help and support.
Because everything starts from home.
For so long, the federal government had promised that there would be a national for Indigenous, by Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing strategy. But after all these years of promises, we're still waiting for that to happen.
It is so amazing to think about the future we can have if this document and the words and the vision within it are brought to life.
What AHMA is working for is, oh my gosh, it's so needed and so valuable.
I survived. I'm still here, and I'm going to make a difference. Thank you.
Thanks, Garcia.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think I've discovered I actually can't read my notes without my glasses, so I'm going to put those on now. Nothing speaks more power than the words of the people. And that video is about sharing with each and every one of you the lived experience of British Columbian Indigenous peoples in their fight for housing and homelessness challenges. So thank you for taking the time. We have a longer video that you can find on our website as well. Before I go too much further, I want to honor and acknowledge that we are on the Mi'kma'ki territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the two urban Indigenous housing providers in this territory, Wenjiquam Housing Corporation and Taiwak Housing Association. I also want to raise my hand to the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center and Toyaksitnun Pam for your opening words this morning. Indeed, no one should be homeless. We value the frontline work that each and every one of you do every day. So I'm not going to go through my bio again. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. What wasn't in my bio, however, is the reality that I'm a 60s scoop child. I was literally taken away off of the birthing table from my birth mother. I was fostered and then adopted into a non-Indigenous family and non-Indigenous community, completely dispossessed from my sense of cultural belonging to my traditional community and my ancestral lands. And I share that with you because it gives a background on understanding not only where the passion that I bring to the table comes from, but an understanding of the makeup of the legacy of colonization that has dispossessed up to 80% of our entire Indigenous populations across Canada through the legacy of colonization and practices like the residential school, residential daycares, the 60s scoop, and the reality that we have more Indigenous children in care today than we ever had during the residential school era. And all of those are current legacies that our Indigenous people are having to address through trauma-informed practices. There is not a single Indigenous person that you will have ever met that doesn't have some form of connection to intergenerational trauma. And if we can understand that legacy, we can start to have some compassion and understanding on the strength of what we call for as for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing solutions when we start to tackle the Indigenous housing and homelessness crisis. I'm sad to see that the minister stepped out right now, because if I wanted to just convey one or two messages out of the entire conversation this afternoon, it would be that the government understands that it is the responsibility, and this actually comes from our federal housing advocate, Marie-Josée, in response to a disencampment process that happened in one of our communities in British Columbia, where the representation was 99% Indigenous peoples, and not one Indigenous community advocate was allowed to be in the presence to support those residents as they were disencamped and treated inhumanely. She wrote that it is the responsibility of every level of government to recognize the distinct rights of Indigenous peoples, our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and meaningfully include them and the organizations supporting them in the development of policy approaches. AHMA and its providers have been supporting BC's First Nations and our Métis peoples for over 50 plus years. Collectively, our organization has over 1,000 years of collective experience in supporting Indigenous peoples in urban areas. We have a proven track record. So let's focus on that issue rather than on the divisive language of government, which often pits urban Indigenous people against their First Nations, Métis, and Inuit brothers and sisters. Don't worry, I'll find the minister later and ensure he gets the message directly. But the reality is, for us to affect the change that Minister Fraser alluded to during his keynote, we must include all Indigenous leadership at the economic tables of Canada. Anything less than that is perpetuating the ongoing legacy of marginalization of us as Indigenous leaders. And the other message I think that government needs to hear loud and clear, because we all know that elections are going to be coming soon in British Columbia, perhaps sooner rather than later. We know that this federal government will likely be in election sooner rather than later as well. We know that there has been a massive announcements that went out over the last few years from both provincial governments and federal governments to address the housing crisis. But we aren't actually seeing the net outcome. We aren't actually seeing the investment of those funds into your communities. And so my second ask would be that government get that money out the door now, not later, because we're going to be in election time and anything else would be just another broken promise to all of our communities. I'm not going to go into too much of the detail around the history and legacy of our organization. I kind of felt like a really old person when my introductory bio says that I've been in this sector for over 27 years. In fact, this coming April 2024 will be 30 years working in this housing sector. But the bulk of those years, my daughter is actually 30 years old. She'll be 31 in May, and I tell everybody this story. My daughter's first words were not mama, they were AHMA, because that is how long we have been fighting the good fight for urban Indigenous leadership to have a collective voice with government, and AHMA has been doing so for nearly 30 years. One of the other definitions I think is important to explain is the definition of urban, rural, and northern Indigenous peoples. Our organizations, clearly over 100 of them across the country of Canada, came together under CHRA's Indigenous Caucus in 2011. And we started to realize that there was this real divide and conquer language within all levels of government around First Nations, Métis, Inuit, political organizations versus the reality that up to 80% of all Indigenous peoples reside in urban areas in your communities. And so we decided to get together and create a language that helps self-identify the work and the commitment that our organizations have dedicated ourselves to. And we call that urban, rural, and northern, AKA EARN, because we know that urban Indigenous people since colonization have been needing to, for a multitude of reasons, navigate and migrate themselves into our urban, rural, and northern communities to find a sense of belonging. AHMA in British Columbia oversees 95% of all urban Indigenous housing programs, and we oversee about 39 different operating agreements that start from the provincial government and continue back to the 1970s urban native housing government agreements, much like Taiwak has and Wenjiquam. But many of the programs that our providers service include things such as homelessness prevention, parenting skills, mental health programs, and substance use support. It's much more than just the bricks and mortar. It is widely known, as you saw in the video, that the playing field for Indigenous peoples is not even. Indigenous people have a distinct and different socioeconomic reality, and it requires a more holistic and a committed response from all levels of government. And AHMA has worked with our members and our providers to reclaim the rights to self-determination. And we do that through culturally appropriate and trauma-informed manners to support our community on the ground. The reality is many Indigenous peoples do not live on their reserve lands or in connection to their cultural home communities, and much of that can be tracked back to the colonial displacement and dispossession from their homelands. For those of you that are maybe looking for some education around the concept of dispossession and displacement, there's a couple of books I'd strongly recommend, and especially coming into an election and this need to call for government to put that money to good work in the very near future. One is called Fragile Freedoms. It talks about how the structures of this country, the foundation of this country, is actually really based on horrific practices that have marginalized not just Indigenous peoples, but multiple subsets of humans based on political or other wartime issues. And if we all understand just how fragile of a world we genuinely live in, we might be able to proceed with our solutions with a little more compassion and perhaps a little more passion when we argue for those that are most vulnerable. The other book I would recommend is a book called The Dispossessed by Jeffrey York. It's a 1980s journalistic book that was written after he traveled all across Canada and talked to some of our most despaired communities across BC and Canada. And he came up with the concept of the dispossessed that really speaks to the mental health and socioeconomic impacts of what happened here in the country of Canada. So I would encourage you to take a look at those when you start to think about how you can have an impact for urban Indigenous peoples who are coming into your communities seeking support and seeking housing. As I said, we encourage all levels of government not only to collaborate with each other, because we see a lot of siloing. We know that the issues we face every day in our communities are much more than the bricks and mortar. We need to have healthcare issues. We need to have parenting support. We need to have grief and crisis counseling support. We need to have gender-based violence support for our communities. All of those issues overlap and intersect where somebody can feel a sense of belonging. And so we need government to collaborate with each other, but they also need to be collaborating with you, the housing experts, the lived experience experts on the ground who can actually bring tangible solutions to government that can help make our world more equitable, more livable, and create more sustainable communities. There is no doubt that the political landscape is constantly changing, but AHMA believes that housing can and should be a non-partisan issue. I really appreciated the minister's sentiment about successive governments, because if we really look at the crisis we're in, it is decades of neglect from successive governments in this country, and there is more than enough blame to go around. What we need now is tangible, measurable outcomes and investments into our housing programs. So that's why we want to open up with that call to action. As you know, Canada is experiencing an unprecedented affordable housing crisis, compounded by the climate crisis. And we know that housing is a remedy for many of our problems in our society. In AHMA's strategy, as you heard about in our opening bio, AHMA's urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy evidenced that for every $1 invested in urban Indigenous housing and support programs, there is a 740% social and direct return on investments, factoring in tax revenues, employment, savings in other government spending, social returns, improvement in mental health and mental health, and it just makes sense. Investing in housing is the way forward for our community. At this moment, at least 100 Indigenous-led service providers across the country are ready to deliver the housing for those who are most vulnerable. However, as you heard from the minister, these projects are struggling to complete their work successfully due to ongoing lack of appropriate investments and rising housing costs. If these projects fail because they don't have enough resources for completion, the significant unmet need is only going to grow. AHMA and many others across this country have been advocating for a new national housing strategy that prioritizes our right to housing and focuses on culturally safe, trauma-informed solutions for the most vulnerable groups within Canada, such as women fleeing violence, single parents, youth, those experiencing homelessness, those trapped in vicious poverty cycles, and those with complex health requirements. Indigenous families are disproportionately overrepresented in all of those categories. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report alone mentions housing 299 times because it is critical to protecting women and children. It is going to take every one of us working together to meet the dire needs within this housing crisis, as well as an unwavering commitment to maximum available resources. Our For Indigenous, by Indigenous structure allows us to negotiate on behalf of Indigenous housing providers and build credibility, equal partnerships, and access to funding and recognition of furthering Indigenous self-determination and reconciliation. Reconciliation is the work for all settlers, and it's the work of making a broken relationship better. This requires trust building, accountability, joint efforts, and an investment of resources. Reconciliation takes action and empowerment. A key underlying principle that we have adhered to is nothing about us without us, and that includes the Indigenous population as a recognized self-determining community. We do have recent national human rights claims related to systemic racism within Canada that have been brought to the federal government to demonstrate how this is slowing progress towards reconciliation. Only through meaningful engagement and inclusion with Indigenous housing and service providers can the social, economic, and Indigenous rights of Indigenous peoples be claimed and protected. I'm not going to go through all of these stats because I'm sure I was talking to somebody earlier, you know, last year I used to say we all only need to look in our backyards to see how deep this crisis is becoming. Now we all need to only look into our own families, into our own immediate friendship circles to really see how bad this housing crisis has become. And we know that the impact on Indigenous peoples has actually been exponentially increased as a vulnerable population. We know that intergenerational poverty and trauma play a huge role in that Indigenous people are 13 times more likely to experience homelessness than non-Indigenous peoples. The era and the legacy of colonial oppression has impacted Indigenous families on many fronts when it comes to housing needs. Again, I'm not going to go into all of these. Almost twice as many Indigenous families are in core housing need compared to non-Indigenous families. Indigenous peoples are more likely to live in housing that is inadequate or substandard, and they are far, far less likely to ever own their own dwelling. We are not only in a housing crisis, this is without a question an ongoing crisis of inequity. Understanding how Indigenous people experience homelessness will help curate better solutions. Following the launch of our strategy in 2022, our organization and our strategy has received national recognition and broad endorsement as the expert national baseline for Indigenous housing solutions and is an example of excellence in Indigenous research and practice. Our strategy mobilizes community advocacy and action on Indigenous terms. We created the strategy with a vision firmly rooted in inclusivity, community, empowerment, and resilience, and it reflects the current Indigenous reality and emphasizes the importance of us moving forward together in the tradition of community. And we encourage you all to read and endorse our strategy on our website. Concerns around rising homelessness and encampments are shared in all of our communities. That's why we are here today. AHMA has heavily emphasized the need to support people sheltering in informal settlements with dignity, with services, and with pathways to housing that resolve encampments for the long term. The BC government and the Federal Housing Advocate have heard from AHMA how important it is to listen to the voices of those who have been most impacted, and the need to proceed with thoughtful partnerships and collaboration. Many of you know how this impacts low-income families, single parents, and youth aging out of care. We also know that the average age of incarceration has dropped considerably. Youth are moving from care to corrections, with no support and access to safe, affordable housing being a huge barrier at every stage. And progress that prioritizes those most vulnerable to homelessness is central in our advocacy work. We have researched and offered various for Indigenous, by Indigenous solutions for those experiencing homelessness that are trauma-informed, low barrier, culturally safe, and based on lived experiences. We also have created, through our leadership and advocacy in the province of BC, a program called Complex Care Housing, or in the Nuu-chah-nulth language, Hisukis-kawak, which means everything is one and all is interconnected. It really comes down to understanding that there isn't a single piece of life for any human being that can't be traced back to having that sense of belonging, that place of belonging that you can call a home. Your health care, your education, your child care, your work. How many times have we heard in communities that we have the working homeless? We have people making $38 an hour that are living in their cars because they can't afford the rent in their community. We have families that have two incomes living in homeless encampments, living in informal settlements because they can't afford the rent in their community. It is incumbent upon each and every one of us to hold governments of all levels accountable for a collective solution to this housing crisis. And complex care, being one of the first of its kind again in the country, is an innovative approach. It's breaking down those silos between mental health and health organizations and silos within government to bring a unified, culturally safe, trauma-informed approach to the complex needs of our communities living in homelessness crises. Central to a lot of our work is also understanding the need for cultural safety. Our Director of Operations, Celeste Hayward, shares that cultural safety isn't actually an Indigenous language. It's not an Indigenous world. But what you will see in most of our Indigenous communities is the concept of wellness, the concept of belonging, the concept of helping each other live a good life. Those words you will find through Indigenous language before you will ever find the concept of cultural safety. But we know that many of our non-Indigenous partners and colleagues across the sector meet a certain population. Our statistics in BC indicate that up to 30% in any housing and support program could be Indigenous. So there is value in AHMA bringing to you our lived experience of what it means to create the 4 pillars of cultural safety. And again, I'm not going to go into the details of that because I see my clock is running out, but happy to share with anybody the training and program that we're running around cultural safety. Beyond complex care and our strategy, we also were the first of our kind to create, in collaboration with our partners in BC, the first ever $500 million rental protection fund, which is about protecting our purpose-built rentals that we've been eroding over time through private sector acquisitions and creating a sector-led acquisition fund. We know that BC's investment has given rise to proof of this concept, that this model can be replicated and its impact multiplied by others. And the demand that we're already seeing after our first call for proposals is indicative of the capacity for this model to scale, not only in British Columbia, but across the country. And again, I was hoping the minister would be here to hear that so that he could get the message to create a federal acquisition fund as well for all of you. I also encourage you all to take a look at the newly incorporated National Indigenous Collaborative Housing, Inc., which was created in late 2022 in response to the announcements of the $300 million in 2022 from the federal budget for an EARN strategy, the announcements in 2023 for a $4 billion investment. We recognized that we needed to have a national Indigenous voice that could speak on behalf of each and every one of your communities where you are dealing with urban Indigenous populations experiencing this housing and homelessness crisis. And it is also founded on the same principles that AHMA was founded, that we as Indigenous people know best how to meet the needs of our Indigenous community. We encourage you to take a closer look at the Nishi website, and I believe we have a Nishi board member here in the audience, Robert Byers. I'm sure he would be happy to share some of these details about Nishi with you. To summarize it all, we know that urban Indigenous populations have specific needs that must be met, recalling that nearly 80% of all Indigenous peoples live in urban environments. And there are many, many steps that you can take, but the reality is you must include urban Indigenous leadership at your economic tables of Canada. To close, I'm going to close with the calls to government. We issued a very detailed letter to the federal government ahead of the economic statement coming out later this month. But I'm going to reiterate the 3 things I directly said to Prime Minister Trudeau earlier this year when I saw him in May. 1, we want him to release the full $281.5 million to Nishi. Their economic stability requires this. It is not acceptable for them to dole it out in a paternalistic fashion. Two, we need them to increase the 2023 Earn Indigenous allocation of $4 billion to what their own National Housing Council recommended as a minimum $6.3 billion for 2023. And third, they need to release that money now, not in 2024. The literal truth, and you guys all live and breathe this every day, our people are dying on your doorsteps while government ties that money up in bureaucracy. We need you to stand with us and call them to release that money now. Toyak Sim, thank you everyone. I'm going to leave it at that, and hopefully my slides will be available to you if you have any questions or comments. Toyak Sim, thanks everyone.
Nakomi, thank you, Margaret. So I want to thank everyone for being here for lunch and hearing and sharing and learning and listening. Very briefly, I just want to share some words that I had heard in the spiritual room this morning from Clint. And it builds upon what Margaret said with respect to Indigenous reconciliation and working and living amongst or neighbors with our Indigenous people. It's important to focus on ceremony. Ground your work, guide your work on ceremony. I know for the Western concept, ceremony doesn't naturally seem to fit with that. But it does if you stop and you think as to how it might. Because ceremony is based on the action and practice of fulfilling and respecting the requirements of ritual, morality, and law. If you put ceremony at the forefront, you will be guided in a good way. And if you don't know what that actually means with the Indigenous communities and peoples that you work with, ask. Because in my experience, if you're respectful, you're open, you're willing to learn and willing to listen and work with us, we will share with you what ceremony is. And we can do so much more if we do it together. So I wanted to share that, and thank you, Clint. It was so important. I will also want to remind everyone of tonight. There is the welcome reception being hosted by the Halifax Host Committee here in this ballroom. I also want people to know that everything today for this afternoon is being delayed by 15 minutes, so your next concurrent sessions start at 12:45, and that 15-minute delay just follows through for the rest of the afternoon. I also want to remind everyone to take your personal belongings from this room with you, because they need to be able to do that setup for that reception. And please don't take the dolls. I know that they're on your tables and they're so lovely and attractive, but I've been asked to let you know, please don't. And I think, you know, what I absolutely want you to take away, and I've said it before and I'm going to say it again, is Ayungi is not only the word that you say after something good has been done. It is also can be said at the beginning of the good work or good effort that actually needs to happen. So it's about also creativity and flexibility. It's about figuring out how to get that work done. And I know that there are many challenges working with government and bureaucracy and policies, but I promise you, from someone who's been working on many issues for over 30 years, from frontline with non-governmental organizations and from within government, there is usually a way. If we care and we think and we work hard, it's not just we can't do it, it's how can we get it done? Because the only way that we are going to achieve what needs to be achieved to end homelessness is that commitment. We will get it done. Embrace Ayungi. Ayungi in the work that you do from the front end, and celebrate the successes as well at the back end. So Ayungi, everyone. Thank you.